much for a very nice introduction. You're quite generous there. So if everyone is ready, then we can get started. Today we're going to be talking about the ecology of individual organisms, the importance and the effects of water, temperature, and food on these individual organisms. Okay, so before we get into some nitty-gritty details about individual animals, we'll eventually get to some case studies on a few individual animals which make for interesting studies. But for now, let's talk about some broad concepts. First one would be optimal foraging theory. This is basically a theory that states that any animal will try to take in the highest amount of nutrition for the least expense. So every time an animal goes to forage for food, whether it's a lion which is hunting or whether it's a baboon which is looking for, they're going to look for the most amount of nutrition for the least amount of work. Which is why if there's a baboon which comes and steals your sandwich, that's it sorted for the rest of the day. It doesn't need to keep walking around looking for tiny little beetles and seeds, and berries and things on the ground. So it's much more efficient for that baboon to take the sandwich out of your hand. The same thing goes for a lion. If a lion can catch its prey quite easily without having to run too much, without having to fight too much or risk injury, it's going to take that prey rather than something else which is more dangerous or faster. Which is why they often take zebras, because zebras don't really have a lot of horns, although they can kick very hard, and they don't run quite as fast as hartebeest or as gazelles, but they also have a lot of meat on them. I hope that makes sense. So nutrition comes at an expense. There's heat and energy loss every time we consume food. And the nutrition that an animal gains must match or exceed the energy which is lost during those normal activities of mating and foraging. If it does not match the energy lost in those activities, then the animal will start to lose condition. While some animals may have narrow diets during times of plenty, they may have the luxury of being quite selective. They then may broaden their diets in times of scarcity. If there's drought, or if some animals have moved out of the area, a lion may decide to broaden its horizons in terms of what it will hunt. If you go to places like Masai Mara, where there's a huge amount of variety of prey animals for lions, they will focus on animals which are easy to hunt. If you go to other areas where there's a much lower variety of prey items, they might go for animals which are harder to hunt, which require a little bit more coordination, which risk a little bit more injury because they're forced into it. I hope that makes sense. So let's now talk a little bit about energy requirements related to shape and size. So in general, larger, rounder shaped organisms exchange energy with the environment more slowly. So it's favorable to be large and round rather than to be small and cylindrical. Large spherical organisms have the most favorable surface to volume ratio. Basically, that means they have a very large external surface and a smaller internal volume. Sorry, the other way around. Sorry, maximum internal volume and minimal external surface. So two organisms of the same volume, let's say you have two organisms which have a volume of 24 milliliters, they will, if one of them is spherical and one of them is cylindrical, the spherical animal, the sphere-shaped animal will exchange heat and energy with the environment much more slowly, and therefore that is a more efficient shape. We'll get into this a little bit more. They're able to increase their storage of water as well, so they lose water less quickly. So all animals gain or lose heat from solar radiation, from infrared radiation, They can gain heat from convection, lose heat from conduction, evaporation, and their metabolism, the internal workings of their body, their heartbeat, etc., is what creates heat, at least for animals which are called endotherms, which we'll get to as well. Control over this gain or loss of heat is an important factor to maintain a relatively constant body temperature. Okay, and it's important to maintain a constant body temperature for a lot of animals because the chemical reactions for normal bodily functions are maintained within this temperature range. So digestion and movement of nutrients and movement of blood and oxygen can only happen within a particular temperature range. For us as humans, our normal temperature, body temperature, is around 37 degrees Celsius. If the body temperature goes too high, above 37, or too low, below that, then our bodily functions start to suffer, or they may stop altogether, which is why it's so important when we get a fever to try and bring that fever down so that our body can function normally. Okay? And that just means that there's an issue with your internal heat regulation within your body. Okay, so the first type of animal that we'll look at, or a group of animals that we'll look at, are endotherms or homeotherms. These are animals that utilize their metabolism as their primary way of regulating their body temperature. So the examples that we'll look at are mammals and birds, primarily mammals. The advantages of being an endotherm is that an endotherm can remain active at any time of the day or night, even into the winter time, sometimes in places which experience winter, when there's no external heat sources available. They can continue to remain active and forage for food and continue their normal daily or seasonal activities. The disadvantage of being an endotherm is that there's a very, very large nutritional requirement in order to sustain the normal metabolic rate. So the metabolism, remember, is what continues to give that internal heat. And so there needs to be a lot of nutrition in order to maintain that metabolism to thermoregulate. And up to 90% of the food energy that an endotherm takes in may be used just to produce heat through its metabolism. Okay? The other 10% will be used for everything else, for growth, increasing body mass, for digestion, for all the other things that an animal needs to do internally. Okay, so if you look at the surface area to the surface area to volume ratio of an endotherm, the larger, rounder endotherms find it easier to maintain nutritional requirements to sustain their necessary metabolic rate, basically. So, for example, a large round herbivore like a hippo or an elephant can consume poor quality grazing or poor quality browse in terms of for an elephant with a very low nutritional content while maintaining the same metabolic rate for thermoregulation. Okay, so an animal which is not large or round, which is small or cylindrical or a different shape, would have to consume much higher quality food and would probably need to consume a lot more of it in order to maintain that metabolic rate. If you think about some of the shrews or some small rodents, which are not round, but they're a little bit more oval shaped, and they're very, very small, they have an extremely, extremely high metabolic rate. And therefore they need to consume a lot more food in comparison to their body mass, and a lot higher quality food as well than an elephant, which can eat dry, hard grasses. Okay. The next type of animal, group of animals that we'll look at, are the ectotherms. Ectothermy or poikilothermy are animals which use external energy sources to regulate their body temperature. For example, we've got invertebrates, we've got amphibians, reptiles, and fish. And I know fish is a broad thing. There's several different taxonomic orders of fish, but bear with me. So the advantages of ectothermy are that there's a very low nutritional requirement. ectotherms don't need to eat a lot in order to accumulate biomass. And they may only need to eat around 10% of the same amount of food for a similar sized endotherm. Does that make sense? Sorry, I worded that a little bit strangely. Sometimes only 10% of what's required by similar sized endotherm. And over 50% of the food that an ectotherm eats will be converted to biomass, into growing larger, into the growth of the body. In any given piece of savanna, okay, so most of what we're looking at here is savanna. I'm not talking about the marine world. Marine ecology is very different from terrestrial ecology. A lot of this will work for forest ecology as well, but I'm primarily focusing on savanna animals. Okay. So in any given piece of savanna, the biomass, that is the weight of all the living things of ectotherms, may be equal to or greater than all of the endotherms due to the efficiency of turning that food energy into increased biomass. Okay, so for example, in the Serengeti ecosystem, the Mara Serengeti, the biomass of all the termites under the ground is greater than the biomass of the 1.6 million wildebeest, which are cruising around and having their massive, famous migration. So the weight, if you were to take all of the termites under the ground and weigh them against the weight of all of the wildebeest above ground, plus the elephants and the zebras and everything else, the termites would weigh more because it's just that many of them. But they don't need to consume nearly as much food as all of those wildebeest on top of the ground because they're ectotherms and they're not needing to use that food for their metabolism as the wildebeest are. The disadvantage is that the activity of ectotherms is often limited by external factors, for example, the sun, which is why we often see lizards and snakes basking on a rock or a road in order to warm up in that early morning sun. Which is why a lot of the times, if there's a fly which is bothering you during the day, come 7 o'clock in the evening, once the sun goes down and the temperature drops, that fly is going to find a place to sit and it's going to chill out for the rest of the night, and it'll start bothering you tomorrow morning. They are limited by those external factors. A lot of ectotherms, and not all of them, but a lot of them they have a different surface area to body to volume ratio. Many are long and slender, if you think about the reptiles, snakes, and the lizards, and they lose heat and moisture much faster than a large, round elephant, for instance. All amphibians and almost all reptiles, there's a couple of exceptions, are carnivorous or insectivorous. Okay, so that means that they can take in a very high quality, easily digestible protein in order to fulfill their functions. So they need they have a very high nutritional requirement. The obvious exception to this that I can think of off the top of my head would be a tortoise. So the leopard tortoise, for instance, is a very large, rounded-bodied animal with a hardened shell. They have a very different digestive system from most other reptiles. They have kind of a hindgut fermentation digestive system, very similar to a zebra. And it's a very long digestive system as well, which allows for very slow passage of food through the body and a slow metabolic rate. And so they are able to eat vegetable matter. They are herbivores rather than the carnivores like the rest of the reptiles. So this allows for great conservation of energy, constant growth, and a very long lifespan. So some tortoises can live up to 50 years. Some of the very large tortoises, like the Aldabra giant tortoise, can live more than 200 years. And if you don't know about the Aldabra tortoise, I encourage you to go and Google it and see how big they are and how long they can live. Amazing animals. Okay, so let's look at heat production. Body heat for animals can be produced in two additional ways. So we're talking about endotherms again here. Body heat for endotherms is produced in two additional ways beyond the normal metabolic activity. One of them is the actual feeding process. So specific dynamic effect of food. This is when an animal is eating, the act of eating actually increases its body temperature. And then the act of digesting that food also continues to increase that body temperature. This is why sometimes you may, after a big meal, you suddenly feel quite hot and you feel like you need to lay down and put on a fan because you're feeling very hot after having a large meal. The muscle activity of any animal as an animal moves, whether it's hunting or whether it's just walking around, a herbivore, which is walking around looking for food, that movement of the muscles increases the internal body heat. So for a carnivore, like for a lion, for instance, the act of hunting, chasing down prey, may increase the internal body temperature by up to 10 times its normal resting body temperature. So if it's lying under a bush, it'll have X body temperature, and then it chases a zebra for 10 minutes, it's going to have X times 10 body temperature. And then both of these, those points partially explain why predators need to rest so much during the day. The stalking, the chasing, the catching of nutrient-dense meat, and then the eating of it and digesting it all has a very high associated heat production cost. So then there's long rest periods after those activities. Okay, so the basic metabolic rate of an animal can be used to compare energy needs for both ectotherms and endotherms. So the body mass raised to the power of 0.75. Okay, so as the body mass increases, the basic metabolic rate decreases. The larger the animal is, the lower the basic metabolic rate is for that animal in comparison to, for instance, to other animals which are much smaller. So for instance, an elephant, which is around 3,000 kilos on average, is 300 times heavier than a steenbok, which is only around 10 or 11 kilos. But an elephant only requires 72.5 more food energy than a steenbok. It doesn't require 300 times more food energy than a steenbok. So while we always, at least in my world, safari guides, we like to talk to our clients about how much an elephant eats, and it's so impressive that an elephant can eat up to 5% of its body weight per day, and that sounds like a lot of food for a 300 kilo animal, or 3,000 kilo animal, sorry. If we were to do the same calculation for a steenbok or a dik-dik or a tiny pygmy mouse, that amount in comparison to the body weight of the animal would be so much more impressive, the percentage per body weight. So steenboks actually eat a lot more for their own body size than an elephant does. Okay, now we're kind of done with those big, broad concepts. So I want to look at a few individual case studies, some of which you may find interesting, or at least I hope you find them all interesting. So the first one we'll start off with is Oryx, and this, I'm kind of doing it broadly, covering Gemsbok, Besa Oryx here in East Africa, and scimitar horned Oryx in Northern Africa. Oryx may engage in something called heterothermy. They are still endotherms, as all other endotherms are, but they're somehow able to store heat within their body. They allow their body to continue to get hotter and hotter and hotter to reduce water loss. So they generally, Oryx can withstand extremely high temperatures. So they even in those very high temperatures, they won't sweat. They do have sweat glands, but they won't sweat until it gets to extreme conditions. The result is that when they're engaging in this heterothermy, they actually have a higher body temperature at nighttime than they do during the day, because it slowly builds up during the day and then it manifests at night. I don't fully understand this and how the internal workings of how an oryx is able to do this. It's still being studied. There's people who've been studying it since the 60s, and there's a greater understanding now than there was back then, but it's still rudimentary. But it means that they're able to reduce their overall water requirements by about 19%, because they're losing less water during the day through sweat and evaporation. Okay, so they are able to maintain their internal body temperature, that thermoregulation. They're able to do that both physically and physically internally inside their body, and through some particular behaviors. So the physical ways that they do it is, number one, they engage in something which is called nasal panting. That means, similar like a dog that would pant through its mouth when it feels hot, an oryx will pant through its nose, and many other antelopes do this as well. They pant through their nose, breathing in and out quite rapidly, and that air movement going in and out of their nasal passages passes over a fine network of nasal capillaries, which are called the retimirabile. Okay, and this cools the blood. The movement of the air over the retimirabile cools the blood before it reaches the brain, allowing the brain to continue its normal functions. Okay, and then the rest of the body is engaging in heterothermy. It's beginning to store heat, getting hotter and hotter. Now, this has been conventional wisdom for a long time. I read a paper just as I was preparing for this presentation that there is actually some evidence that disputes this, that their body temperature and their brain temperature are different, but there's still lots of research to be done on that. Okay, so during the hottest time of the day, oryxes may also be able to engage or enter a state of torpor. Torpor is almost like a temporary hibernation, where the body functions begin to shut down. They begin to slow down completely. The metabolic rate completely drops very low, which means that the animal then reduces its need for food. It doesn't produce as much heat as it normally would at its normal heart rate. And it also then continues to reduce that water loss through sweating and evaporation. So generally an oryx will go stand under a tree at the hottest time of the day, and its body will almost completely shut down. Its heart rate will completely drop to only a few beats per minute, so that it's not producing heat as it normally would by walking in the sun. The muscles produce heat. The heart is producing heat. Now it's just stopped. Okay. As I mentioned, they do have sweat glands, but they will only engage those sweat glands and start sweating in the most extreme conditions. And basically, this oryx sweating has only been observed in captive situations, which have been designed to push those oryx to the absolute limit. They've been held in a very hot environment in complete direct sunlight the entire day, where they have no option to enter the shade. And only in those situations have they actually been observed to sweat. In normal situations, they would find a tree to sit under. They wouldn't need to. So also internally, the oryx has something called the colon ascendens, which is part of their colon, which is where most of the water absorption from their food happens within their internal organs. Okay, the colon ascendens in a normal animal is much shorter. Within an oryx, it makes up about 85% of that colon. That means that while food particles are passing through that colon, they are able to absorb as much moisture as possible. So food that goes into their stomach and goes into their colon as it enters the colon, it may have around 82% moisture content. By the time it leaves the gut as feces at the end, it may only have 56% moisture content or less. That means that's about a 25% moisture absorption rate, which is higher than most other animals. So when an oryx drops its dung on the ground, they've extracted as much moisture as physically possible from that food. An oryx requires around 2 to 4 liters of water a day, but they can also go for up to around 6 days without drinking. So when they do find water, they will drink lots of it. So oryx do drink water. They take advantage of water when it's there, and they will drink lots of it. In case they then move off to an area where there will be no water, they can go for another 6 days without it. And even if that, they can still use that water even if it's very brackish, very salty. So they can drink and take advantage of water as about 1.8% dissolved salts, which most other species would completely avoid or would not be able to handle it. Their kidneys will not be able to handle them. Okay, then behaviorally, of course, oryx will move. They'll spend a lot of time in the shade at the hottest time. They have 15% less activity during the daytime than they do at night or early morning. They focus their feeding times at nighttime, specifically in the early morning when the plants that they're feeding on hold the most moisture. So as the plants, during the night, there's often a lot of dew in the air, there's moisture in the air which starts to condense, and the plants take in that moisture. And the last 1 hour before the sun rises is when those plants hold the most moisture. So there's a plant called, which is the genus Disperma, and they may increase their water content from 2% at midday to around 40% just before sunrise. And so the oryx will focus on feeding at that time of day and focus on feeding those plants which increase that water content. Okay, and they're very selective in what they feed. They can feed on tubers. They have sharp paws or sharp hooves that dig into the ground in order to access tubers under the ground. They feed on melons and cucumbers, which hold a lot of water. There's also some evidence to show that they can moderate their breathing, can just slow their breathing down, because as an animal breathes, moisture comes out. Even we see this if we breathe early in a cold morning, you'll see moisture coming out of your own mouth as you breathe. So they can regulate that to reduce that. Let's look at elephants now. Okay, elephants are very large, round hindgut fermenters. Hindgut fermenters basically just means that they are not ruminants. They don't chew their cud. They take the food in, it goes in through their stomach, and once it passes through their stomach, then it goes into the small intestine and into something called the cecum, which is the elephant equivalent of our appendix or similar to it. And they have particular microbiome in that cecum. There's little microorganisms which then create fermentation, which is necessary to break down cellulose in the food that they eat. It's less efficient in terms of breaking down cellulose than a ruminant's gut, like an oryx, but an elephant obviously can grow up to around 3,500 kgs. So that large spherical mass means that they have large spherical shape means that they have a low metabolic mass. Their metabolic mass is only around 13 to 15% of their body weight. So they require proportionally less food than other hindgut fermenters. For example, a zebra has which is a much smaller animal, has a metabolic mass of 25% of its body weight, as opposed to an elephant, which is 13 to 15% of its body weight. I hope that's clear. I know I'm giving percentages and facts and figures, and you can't really see it, but Bug's doing an excellent job of illustrating this all on the screen. I hope you can all see what she's got there. So elephants, on average, will eat up to about 5% of their body mass in dry food every day, but they can get by with as little as 2% of their body mass each day, which is a very low amount of food for such a large animal. So they can be quite selective with their food with a high nutritional content. They're looking for foods which have high digestibility in order to speed up digestion. Elephants are mixed feeders. Okay, so during the during the wet season, they may predominantly look for grasses, and in the dry season, they may predominantly look for browse. But either of those can be taken in any season, depending on availability of what's there, and also each elephant has its personal preference of what it thinks tastes better and what it likes to eat. And there'll be some species which they may avoid throughout the year and will only take as a last resort. For instance, in Kenya, what we call Euclea divinorum. In Southern Africa, you call it a blue guari, or sorry, magic guari. That is a very unpalatable species to most animals, including elephants, and they will often only eat a Euclea as a last resort when there's not too much else left, because it's very high in tannins, so it's quite bitter, and it doesn't have a lot of protein in it. It's not very nutritious. Elephants can store up to 4.5 liters in a pouch just under their tongue, which is called the pharyngeal pouch. Okay, so once they get to water, they'll drink as much as they want, they'll spray it over their bodies, and then they will put around 4 liters into that pharyngeal pouch under their tongue, and they're able to then keep that for when they really need it. If they get into a place which is very hot, very dry, and they need to cool down, they may drink it. They may use their trunk to pull it out and then put it into their mouth to drink it, or they may then use it to spray over their bodies in order to cool down. Okay, so elephants can also go up to around 5 days without drinking water. If you think about the desert elephants in the Kalahari, they're able to go for a very long time without drinking water. They won't be doing very well after day 5, but they can manage it. The young elephants are able to get a lot of moisture by eating the dung of their mothers. They also get a lot of beneficial gut microbes. So all of us, all mammals we have, or all animals, tend to have a microbiome in our stomachs, and that microbiome builds up over the years, and it builds up in response to the foods that we're eating. Elephants are able to speed up that process by eating their mother's dung in order to get that microbiome as quickly as possible, so that they can start eating some of the same food as their mothers. Elephants may also urinate on the sand, and then they will throw the sand over their bodies in order to cool them down. Many of you may be aware of elephants' ears, which are made up of very, very thin skin, and it's got a very fine network of lots and lots of blood vessels which are spread through those ears. So when they fan their ears back and forth, the air passing over those blood vessels cools down, and then that cooler air is passed to the rest of the body and into the brain to cool the body down. That's a very effective way to cool an elephant down. So in a very hot environment, you will see them fanning their ears. Elephants don't have sweat glands like an oryx does, but just through evaporation through their skin, they can still lose up to 2.5 liters of water per hour, which is a lot. Okay, let's move on to big predators. I've kind of lumped lion and leopard together here. Obviously, their behavior is quite different, but their internal workings and how they handle water and food and thermoregulation is all quite similar. Okay, so both lions and leopards actually have a very poor success rate when it comes to hunting. Somewhere between 17 to 30% success rate for both species. That means that they're using energy and heat, and they're basically wasting that energy and heat on around 70 to 80% of the hunts that they engage in, or the pursuits that they go on. And only 17 to 30% of the hunts that they begin result in catching food, which they can then use to replenish those energy reserves. That's why lions and leopards spend around 20 hours a day resting. So we often think of lions as being very lazy animals. They don't do anything, they just lie there. It's not that they're just lying there for no reason because they're lazy, it's because it takes a lot of energy to catch their food, and it takes a lot of energy to digest their food. So the digestion of a full stomach of meat, if a lion is able to eat its fill, and has a one big round stomach at the end of eating a zebra, around 25% of the energy gained from eating that is just used to digest it. Or the 25% of the energy that the lion has is used to digest the food that they're able to take in. So meat is very low in dry matter. It's very high in easily digested protein and fat. Okay, and protein and fat can be used for body growth and energy production, which is why lions and leopards can become so large. Lions, leopards both have short intestines in general. The length of the intestine for a lion and leopard is only around 6% of its body length, okay, which sounds like a lot, but compare it with a wildebeest, for instance, a large or medium-sized ruminant, and their intestines will be 24 times the length of their body, because they have to have a lot more surface area within their body to facilitate the digestion of very difficult to digest carbohydrates, especially things like cellulose and lignin, which require fermentation and require all these extra microbes and extra surface area to be able to take in. So lions and leopards can have much shorter intestines to be able to take in that food. Okay, so both hunt, the act of hunting, and the digestion of the resulting food that they catch, all of that produces heat. That production of heat then further requires resting in a cool environment, often accompanied by intense panting. You see a lion which has just finished eating a meal, and you'll see it lying under a tree with its eyes closed, and it's going, and it looks very uncomfortable because it's after eating that the body is producing so much heat for it to be able to digest that food that it feels very uncomfortable and needs to go lie in shade. Lions may also lay on their back under the shade in order to expose the thin skin on their belly to cool breeze. Both lions and leopards will also climb trees to get away from the hot ground and to take advantage of the air currents moving up at that slightly a few meters above the ground. Now, leopards climb trees for other reasons as well, and so do lions, but that is one of the reasons why they may get up into a tree. And I think we will finish with crocodiles. Okay, so this is the only ectotherm that we'll be looking at specifically. Crocodiles are the largest ectotherms in the savannah. They can be over 5 meters long. They can weigh almost 1,000 kilos, not quite. They have something called unidirectional breathing, which they share with birds. So crocodiles are very closely related to birds. They are more closely related to birds than the rest of the reptiles are. And crocodiles and birds split off from dinosaurs around the same time, around 150 million years ago. So they have a lot of similarities, crocodiles and birds do. So they have something called unidirectional breathing, where they take in air into their mouth. It passes down through the lungs. The lungs take the oxygen in, and then that is passed on to bronchi and other capillaries in the body for gas exchange. It's not just straight into the lungs and then straight out again. It passes through almost a circular channel from the lungs beyond into parabronchi and other bronchi, which then go into final thing which goes out of the trachea. Sorry, I'm not getting too technical because I don't want to weigh you down with it. But point is, they're able to lower their breathing rates, much lower than is required by mammals, which if you lower your breathing rate, then that means you're reducing the amount of heat which is lost and the amount of moisture which is lost. As we mentioned earlier, breathing out allows moisture to escape. So they're able to reduce that. They also have a special valve in their four-chambered heart. Okay, so this is the other thing, is that a lot of reptiles don't have a four-chambered heart, but crocodiles do, very similar to birds again. And this special valve in their heart reduces the blood flow to the lungs, and it pushes that blood to the rest of the body, which means that they need a much lower heart rate, and they can reduce their heart rate to around 3 beats per minute in a time where they don't need to be very active. 3 beats per minute, which means, again, much lower heat production within the body. So in a very hot environment, this is very useful. A lot less moisture is lost as well. So lower metabolic rates means lower or more food energy can be used to build body mass, and less food overall needs to be consumed. So for instance, a crocodile female, once it lays its eggs, it may sit and protect those eggs for 90 days, for 3 months, without eating at all, because it needs to protect its eggs, and the minute it goes off to hunt, it leaves the eggs exposed to monitor lizards and herons and all sorts of baboons and all sorts of other things. So it will often stay with the eggs for 3 months without eating. It's able to do this by reducing that heart rate, and by being able to take advantage of high quality food and not having to utilize that food for anything else other than body mass growth. Crocodiles thermoregulate by moving in and out of the water. If they get too cold, they come and sit out on the bank and they bask in the sun. If they get too hot, they'll either go into the water or they'll go into the shade. They'll open their mouth to allow heat to escape from their mouth, or they may close their mouth to keep the heat in. And then the flat, long, wide body shape exposes a high proportion of surface area to sun and warm rocks, or to quickly cool in the water. So the shape of a crocodile is very well adapted to its environment in order to thermoregulate as well. I hope that all makes sense. I think I may have gone over time a little bit, but I did get cut off for a couple of minutes, so apologies for that. Does anybody have any questions? I've seen that there's a couple of questions in the chat. I think Johan or Maret, you were gonna handle this.
I see everybody's applauding in the chat, and we have questions. Gina, are you able to unmute yourself? I can see you're the first one with questions there. And then I would like to invite anybody with a question. Please use the reaction tools at the bottom to raise your hand or attract our attention, or you also welcome to type into the chat. We welcome your questions. It would be great to hear from you. If you're unable to use the reaction tools, just switch on your video and wave at us. We'll catch you at some point. I can see Kirsten's got her hand up. Kirsten, you want to go with the first question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So Zarek, yeah, fantastic talk, and Bug, thank you very much. It's been amazing. My question was about sort of really odd mammals. Zarek, I'm going to test you a little bit. I want to know about the pangolin, which is obviously the only scaled mammal. Yeah, what it does with thermoregulation. And I also wanted to ask you about the platypus, which is just simply an odd animal. I wonder what you know about them.
Kirsten, so the pangolin is, because it's a mammal, it's an endotherm, so it's using its metabolic rate to regulate its temperature. The scales, I couldn't tell you how the scales may improve or make it harder for it to regulate its temperature. What I do know is that pangolins tend to be mostly nocturnal, so they won't be out really in the hot sun during the day. They spend most of the day in a den underground where they stay cool, and then they'll come out at night. Perhaps those scales help to keep the body temperature, keep it warm as it's walking around at night. They obviously also serve a body armor purpose as fending off predators. But I couldn't tell you specifically how they conserve energy other than just sleeping most of the day. I couldn't tell you much about their water requirements. I know that from the insects that they eat, the termites and the ants that they eat, they will get a lot of water, a lot of moisture from that, so they won't need to drink nearly as much as something else of the same size. And they are they are a long, thin animal. They're not short and fat and round. So their body shape perhaps isn't quite as efficient for keeping that in terms of energy exchange with the environment, just based on the concepts that we've talked about here. But I haven't done specific research into how that might work for pangolins. As far as duck-billed platypus go in Australia, they are a mystery to me, and I really couldn't tell you. Did you want to know about the thermoregulation or something else?
Yeah, I guess the thermoregulation would be the top of my mind. I mean, I could ask you lots of questions about them, but let's go with thermoregulation.
I'm cheating a bit here.
You're
you
welcome.
can probably hear my.
Zarek, I can let you off the hook, and we can discuss it another time if you'd like to.
Yeah, very good insulation, basically. So what I do know is that because they spend a lot of time in the water, their fur is very thick, and it's quite waterproof, I think. And so even though they spend a lot of time in the water and they get very cold, they are able to hold in that heat through that very thick waterproof fur. Beyond that, I know they have some very interesting internal biology, which is like scientists are constantly discovering new things about platypus and how they are able to stay buoyant in water and how they're able to protect themselves, and the fact that they have little venom glands in their feet and all these weird things that are so different from any other mammal. I think you could probably do a whole 30-minute presentation just on duck-billed platypus and their adaptations to the environment. And I'm definitely not the expert on them by any means.
Thanks, Zarek. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to just move over to a question from Gina in the chat. Am I right if I say that temperature is the major abiotic factor, or do you think they all play equal roles with equal effects in the environment? I'm referring to light, sun, water, temperature, and soil. And then related to that, Gina also asked, how are organisms classified based on their tolerance to temperature? Is there a specific classification?
Thanks, Gina, for that. To the first question about how organisms are classified based on their tolerance to temperature, I'm not aware of any scientific classification. The classification that we generally think of when it comes to how organisms may be classified and organized and how they relate to each other is more taxonomic or phylogenetic classification, which really has very little to do with their thermoregulation or their ability to withstand high temperatures, and more has to do with ancestry and common ancestors and evolution. And sometimes you may find two species which are able to withstand very high temperatures. They may occupy a very similar ecological niche. They may look similar, but they are totally unrelated with each other. And it's just a case of convergent evolution, because that is the best design for that particular ecological space. So, for instance, a hedgehog and an echidna, or something like that. Hedgehogs in Africa echidnas in Australia and Papua New Guinea. They look similar in some way. They occupy a very similar ecological niche. They both have spines on their body. They both are insectivores, but they are not related to each other at all. Echidnas are marsupials. They're monotremes, so they actually lay eggs like a duckbill platypus. And hedgehogs are placentals, just like most other mammals that we're familiar with. But they look similar. They occupy a similar niche. So there's not really classification based on how an animal is able to withstand extreme temperatures that I'm aware of anyway, something I could look up. The next question that you had was, am I right if I say that temperature is a major abiotic factor? I don't know. I would hesitate to say that one is more important or more major than the other. Again, it depends on the individual organism. If you were to look at a water buck, then you might say that water is a more important factor for a water buck than it is for an oryx, because an oryx can go for 6 days without water. A water buck needs to drink water once or sometimes even twice a day, and a water buck will never be more than 1 or 2 kilometers away from a permanent water source. So in that case, water bucks for a water buck, water is more important. Sorry. Or for other animals like an earthworm, soil may be more important, and what's in the soil, the microbes in the soil and what it eats. So I think the importance of one of those factors over another really probably depends on which organism you're speaking about or you're referring to. And again, it's very difficult to quantify, because all of those are important, and an extreme or scarcity of one of those things may be as detrimental as a scarcity of another one of those things to any particular organism. I hope that answers your question. I know I've been a little bit vague. Maybe we can move on to the next one. Sorry, Gina, if I didn't answer it.
No, Zarek, I thought that was a very good answer, really pointing us towards the context of each animal. There is a comment in the chat from Isolde. If only my lectures at varsity were as palatable and entertaining as this. Amazing. Thanks, guys. And then Dr. Ogilvie, your turn, please. We're trying to unmute you. There you go.
All right. Okay. Thank you. This was amazing. That's all I can say. I was last really a student where I studied ecology in 1984, 1985, and we had textbooks and it all was just written and we just had to read. This simplifies it. It's amazing. It just makes it so simple and so easy to understand. But I'm even thinking even further than our first years and our seniors. I'm sorry, my seniors couldn't attend today, but they were writing a test between 9 and 11. They'll be attending the second session. But if we can get something like this for our matric students to understand their natural sciences, because this is the gap that is missing. So when the students get to first year, or from matric to first year, there's this gap. And if we can get our textbooks rewritten like this, we won't have problems. And I know for a fact, once the first years actually see the YouTube, they're actually going to understand so clearly what is needed and how to understand the stuff. But thank you. I've just got, it's amazing. Thank you. That's Zarek and Bug. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm very impressed, Johan. It worked.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Looks like we will have to collaborate again in the future. All right, so there's a question from, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Murray Isaac or Isaac. Here in Kenya, we're facing adverse severe drought, thus elephants are becoming wild and unfriendly to people. Could lack of water be the reason? Thank you. Yeah, Zarek asking you to comment there on a difficult topic.
Yeah, I think that water is definitely a factor. Food availability is also very much a factor. There's been quite a few studies to show that a lot of animals which die in drought are actually dying from a lack of food more than they are from a lack of water. We see in some of our national parks now, thankfully in the last 1 week, we've been receiving some rain. Don't know how long it's going to last, but in general, over the last couple of months, people have been putting money and resources into filling up dams and things. They're sending in big water bowsers to fill up these dams in Tsavo and in Harubi National Park and various other places, which is great. It's very well intentioned. But it also is not the main cause for animals dying. It's also not the main cause for animals going out of the park and raiding farms. The main cause for animals dying and raiding farms and causing human-wildlife conflict is a lack of palatable, nutritious food. And you may go into Tsavo and you see lots of acacias, and you see lots of other species of plants which still have green leaves on them, but those plants have engaged extreme defense mode where they are producing high levels of tannins, they're producing high levels of other chemicals which are not palatable and which make the food very bitter and not very nutritious to those animals, so those animals move on. And so even though it looks to us like there's green leaves on the trees, the animals know that that food is not available to them. And so they go out of the park and they will raid maize farms, and they'll raid other bean farms, and they'll raid everything else. So yes, drought definitely is a major driver of human-wildlife conflict. And the more grass and forage that there is within our protected areas, the less human-wildlife conflict there's going to be. Water is also a factor.
See, there's a question from Ishmael. Is it possible to share the poster? I'm interested in using it as a digital interactive learning resource material for groups that visit our parks for educational purposes. Bug, if you do not mind, we don't mind. We will share the whole video on our website, sharescreenafrica.org, probably within the next 7 days. And then we will load the poster as a resource there. The whole point of these sessions is that we make everything that we do available for everybody on the African continent to the benefit of all African conservation students, as well as any conservation professional that can use our resources. Everything that you find on our YouTube channel or website, please do use it and share it as much as possible.
I just want to find out, can I share this with schools like Atindumu?
Yes, you're most welcome.
Okay, thank you.
Share away.
Because I think this could just help them and assist them, because a lot of the schools in that area, many don't even have textbooks. So I would like to, on maybe a Saturday morning, get hold of some of the learners and do this with them and let them view it. If you know what the signal is like there, Johan. Somehow I may have to find a way to download it prior to that and then view it without having to have Wi-Fi or something. The signal's really bad out there, but let's see.
It's also something to take note of for all of us. You know, we are not professional, none of us are, except for Bug, are professional illustrators, but the use of infographics will be very important teaching tools in conservation. And also, if you can get your students to draw their own infographics, sometimes when language is a barrier, it's another useful tool for people to relay their knowledge and an easy to understand way to convey concepts in conservation. So, yeah.
My students, they will have to translate it into Zulu. So just to get the message out there 100% correctly. So luckily they can do it. They've got that ability. I don't have that. But yeah, I'll let you know how it works. And
that Londi can help you to translate into Zulu.
Yeah, but I've got the 2 down there anyway, so I don't want to change anything on the PowerPoint, nothing like that, because they've also got to learn English. So that's important, and then my students will just verbally translate it. They will just slow it down, stop, add bits, carry on, add bits, carry on. They'll just do it a bit slower and get
Sure.
it into the loop. But thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Ngiyabonga. All right, everybody, thank you very much. If there are no further questions, anybody else? Last chance? Did I miss anything?
There's
Anybody?
looks like there's one more from Gina here.
Yes. There we go. Can abiotic factors determine water quality?
Gina, I'm not sure I understand your question. Can abiotic factors? I mean, so water is an abiotic factor. Temperature and all of those things, I suppose, are other abiotic factors. There are so many different abiotic factors in an ecosystem environment that potentially, yes, there is something that could affect the water quality. And certainly at certain temperatures, bacteria or algae may form more easily than they would at other temperatures. Like maybe higher temperatures, there's more likely to be certain microbes that will grow and reproduce than there would be at lower temperatures. So in that case, I suppose that temperature is an abiotic factor that may indirectly affect the quality of the water. And then depending on where the water is, if that water is in a cement trough, it's not really going to be affected by soil. But if it's in just a dam or a reservoir, which is just a soil reservoir, then certainly the type of soil in that reservoir will affect the quality of the water. It may become much more turbid, or if it's very sandy, it may be a little bit more clear. So yeah, there's a couple of things that may affect that. But it's such a broad topic. I hesitate to delve into it much more deeply than that. I hope that does answer your question a little bit.
Yeah, I would say to Gina that the perfect person to answer that question is her direct supervisor, Dr. Patrick Otoma. He's already done a lecture on Share Screen Africa. So Gina, ask that question again to him, please. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Bug, for doing such an amazing job of illustrating this. It's much better than any PowerPoint presentation I could have put together. Thank you.